4. From militant to terrorist. Nestor first completed a 6-month term in the anarchist study circle, and it was only once he had fully digested the ideals and goals of libertarian communism that he became a full-fledged member of the Gulyai group. At the time he was working as a foundry worker at the Kerner plant. With a degree of success, the group disseminated libertarian ideas among the nation's peasants, publishing and distributing tracts, but it also took care to reply with direct action to the governmental terror after the fashion of other anarchists from the Russian Empire who had decreed black terror against Tsarism. In order to equip itself with the wherewithal for its various operations, the group decided to carry out expropriations won against the local bourgeois and in the surrounding areas. The indictment drawn up by the prosecution of the Odessa field court-martial when the Gulyai Libertarian Communist Group appeared before it enumerates the following. On September 5, 1906 in Gulyai, an attack upon the home of the businessman Pleskina by 3 individuals armed with revolvers and with faces blackened. On October 10, a fresh attack in Gulyai upon another businessman, Bruck, by 4 individuals, faces concealed by paper masks, who, brandishing revolvers and bombs, demanded 500 rubles for the starving. A little later, a third attack upon a wealthy local industrialist, Kerner, by 4 individuals, with 3 more acting as lookouts. In August 1907 in the nearby village of Gaishu, a 4th attack upon yet another businessman, Gyurvich, by 4 individuals wearing sunglasses. On October 19, 1907, attack upon the mail coach, a gendarme and postman were killed. In 1908, 3 further attacks, again upon businessmen. The monies thus accumulated were used to develop propaganda and for the procurement, through Waldemar Antony, of weapons and bombs in Vienna. The group also had contacts with the Ekaterinoslav group and certain others in Moscow. Another aspect of the Black Terror consisted of torching the properties and goods of the region's big landowners by way of replying to the so-called Stolypin reform designed to abolish the communal assembly, the gromada, in order to foster the emergence of a new stratum of well-to-do peasants, the kulaks, who, it was anticipated, would furnish fresh support for the regime. All of these actions lit a fire under the region's cops. The local Sherlock Holmes, Dixit Novopolin, Police Superintendent Karyakentsev, tipped off by informers and acting on information gleaned from rough and ready questioning of suspects, managed to identify certain individuals as responsible for attacks, although for lack of evidence, he could not arrest them on the spot. In September 1907, Nestor was apprehended in very specific circumstances. A social revolutionary friend by the name of Makhnovist borrowed his revolver, allegedly to take revenge on a gendarme officer who had recently put him through the mill. In fact, Makhnovist used the gun to settle an affair of the heart with his fiancée. He fired 2 bullets into her and pumped the remainder into himself. Mahkno, who was on hand, did not have the time to prevent this unexpected turn of events and rushed to the aid of the wounded. That solicitude was his undoing, for he was apprehended on the spot by the police. Some days later, Antony, who was trying to communicate with him through an intermediary among the guard, was likewise arrested. In vain did they grill Makhno and Antony, nothing doing, they could not get the slightest admission out of them. Karyakentsev told the local post commander on this score. Quote, "I have never before seen men of this mettle. I have plenty of evidence on which to state that they are dangerous anarchists, but although I have put their flesh through a little suffering, I have extracted nothing from them. Makhno seems like a peasant dolt when one looks at him, but I have very conclusive evidence for claiming that it was he who shot at the gendarmes on August 26, 1907. Well now, I have done all I was able to extract admissions but to no effect. On the contrary, he supplied me with facts, which I have checked out and which I have been forced to acknowledge as correct, demonstrating that he was not even in Gulyai on that day. As for the other one, Antony, when I interrogated him, having him beaten at wool, he dared declare to me, 'You, dead meat, you'll never get anything out of me.' And yet I gave him a good taste of the swing." End quote. Despite the flimsiness of the charges against them, Antony was released only after a month and Makhno only after 10 months. It was with that lengthy stay that Nestor, at the age of 18, began his lengthy acquaintance with prisons. Paradoxically, it was a Guliai industrialist, one Vichlinsky, who secured his release by posting bail of 2,000 rubles. All of the rest of the group's militants being outlawed, it was decided that Makhno would adopt a line of behavior, i.e., that he should remain within the law. He then found himself employment with a decorating firm but continued to be an activist by founding an anarchist study group made up of 25 young peasants from Budyenny, a village near Guliai. At its weekly get-together, he would peruse and discuss with them sundry basic texts of anarchist doctrine. The militant group uncovered two names who had infiltrated their ranks, Gora and Kushner, and promptly executed them, then decided to hold a general meeting to wind up the episode. For one of its members, Ivan Levadny, was suspected of being in touch with the police. The suspicions were confirmed when, as the meeting was breaking up, the house in which it was being held was cordoned off by a squadron of Don Cossacks and members of the local Okrana. 3 Levadny suggested that they give themselves up, his treachery being so patent, but they all determined to tough it out and fight. In a daring sortie, abetted by the darkness, they managed to carve a path for themselves by firing their revolvers, cutting down Lepachenko, the second in command of the local police, some Cossacks and detectives. In the course of the operation, Prokop Semenuta, who had founded the group along with Antony, was wounded in one leg. His brother, Alexander, carried him piggyback, but, seeing their pursuers gain on them, Prokop determined to stay behind to slow them up. Down to his last bullet, he blew his own brains out. To avenge his brother's death, Alexander Semenuta, accompanied by Makhno and Philip Onachenko, made up his mind to execute no less a figure than the province's governor, who was due to pay a personal visit to Guliai to look into the whole hullabaloo. This sensational scheme was aborted, for young people were banned from getting anywhere near the governor, the latter being desirous of addressing only heads of households and of sharing with them his outrage at the presence of terrorists in the town. Undeterred, Makhno proposed to dynamite the local Okrana station, using two devices weighing 9 and 14 pounds respectively and originally meant for the governor. The conspirators were ready to give their own lives. An incident prevented them from carrying out their plan. They bumped into a patrol of Cossacks who made to search them. Again they managed to shoot their way out. However, Onachenko was arrested at his home, and Makhno himself was picked up a little later. That arrest probably saved his life, for he had firmly intended to go back a few hours later to give the assassination plan a second try. It transpired that every last member of the group had been given away, first by the careless gossip of Nozozuachenko, a close friend of Nestor's, with Anarch, one Jacques Brin, jailed along with him in Ekaterinoslav, and secondly by the statements of Levadny and Althausen. Interrogated briskly by Karyakentsev, Zuachenko corroborated his admissions with details galore and claimed that what he and the group had done had been prompted purely by political objectives set by the ideas of the people's freedom, for in all, 16 members of the group were rounded up. Only Antony and Alexander Semenuta escaped the dragnet and fled first to France and on to Belgium. According to Levadny, Makhno was deemed one of the most dangerous terrorist members of the group, after the brothers Prokop and Alexander Semenuta. A start was made by accusing him of several expropriations and killings of gendarmes. However, for want of evidence and confessions, only some of these charges could be proceeded with. All of the accused were removed to a prison in Alexandrovsk. Preparation of the case lasted over a year. Meanwhile, Alexander Semenuta, who kept in touch with his people, sent a letter of personal greetings to Karyakentsev, which reads as follows. To Guliai, to Karyakentsev, Poxy Devil, Mr. Superintendent, I have heard it said that you have been searching for me high and low and dearly wish to meet with me. If this be the case, I then beseech you to come to Belgium. Here, freedom of speech is unrestricted, and we will be able to chat at leisure. Signed, Alexander Semenuta, Guliai anarchist. In so doing, Semenuta was laying a false trail, for he returned to Ukraine intent upon arranging the escape of Makhno and his comrades. Above all, he made up his mind to settle accounts with Karyakentsev, the Sherlock Holmes who had been behind the rounding up of the whole group. The policeman was very fond of the theatre, and, all unsuspecting in the belief that Semeniuta was 1,000 leagues away. He blithely went along to see a play very highly rated in Ukraine one autumn evening in 1909, along with his mistress. Semeniuta watched for him, took a seat 3 rows behind him, his pockets heavy with 2 loaded revolvers, but he hesitated to fire, fearing that innocent spectators might be hit. He positioned himself then at the theater exit, behind a tree, surprised Karyakentsev and pumped 3 bullets into him. Alexander Semeniuta had executed yet another gendarmerie officer, one who had especially distinguished himself in the repression. Then he turned his attention to planning Makhno's escape. It was prepared for January 5, 1910 and the removal of the prisoners from Alexandrovsk to Ekaterinoslav. Along with anarchists from the region still at large, Semeniuta positioned himself in Alexandrovsk railway station, disguised as a peasant, dressed in an enormous sheepskin cloak and wearing a papaka. Some comrades waited nearby and some sleighs were ready for the off. Everything seemed to be proceeding smoothly when it was learned that the train had been caught in a blizzard and was running late. Semeniuta was thus obliged to step into the waiting room and there, in spite of his disguise, Althausen, the member of the group who had turned informer, recognized him and in the belief that he himself was the target, alerted the guards. This put paid to the planned escape, but the intrepid Semeniuta again managed to extricate himself at gunpoint. When the authorities learned of his return to Ukraine, they had no doubt but that he was behind several recent, sensational outrages, and they posted a substantial reward for his capture, dead or alive, as he had been decreed public enemy number 1. Over several months, he thwarted all plans to search him out but nonetheless met a tragic end, one might say on account of nostalgia for the land of his birth. Indeed, in the company of a young libertarian by the name of Martha Pivel, he arrived back in Guliopoli for May 1, 1910. One of Makhno's brothers offered to put him up while he himself went off to sleep at his mother's house. Semeniuta's presence was immediately reported to the police, as was to come to light following the seizure of police archives in 1917 by one Pyotr Shurovsky, who was eager for the reward money. The police surrounded him, laid siege to the house and stormed it. They found Semeniuta dead, he having kept his last bullet for himself. His female companion was gravely wounded. That such a daring militant so fanatically devoted to the cause of anarchy could have exercised such influence over the teenaged Makhno, already quite resolute himself, who was to remember him with such emotion all his life, can readily be understood. The direct actions carried out by the Guliopoli anarchist group were not at all out of the ordinary for the years 1906 to 1909, for the tsarist repression was in full swing and the firing squads and hangmen were busy. The timid reforms granted at the start by Nicholas II, who was very conscious of his station, were quickly annulled and the mailed fist took over. Also, every revolutionary in the Russian Empire was resorting to the same sort of activities. At the time, a number of militants like Makhno or Semeniuta met their deaths either in combat or on the scaffold or were deported to Siberia or consigned to penal servitude. The few who survived this heroic struggle were not to forget the sacrifice of their comrades and were to pledge themselves to avenge them promptly in 1917 against the police and other goons of the autocracy. As a rule, the membership of the Guliopoli Libertarian Communist Group was quite young, the older members being 25 years of age while Makhno was the youngest. The indictment drawn up against the group charged the 16 proceeded against, first of all, with illegal subversive association and then with sundry criminal activities, expropriations and armed struggle against the authorities. 14 individuals were implicated: Nestor Makhno, the brothers Anton and Igor Bondarenko, Klim Kurichenko, Philip Chernyavsky, the brothers Philip and Pyotr Onachenko, Ivan Shevchenko, tried and hanged before the main case was heard, Martinova and Zablodsky, Ukrainians, plus Efim Orlov, a Russian, all of them peasants, Norm Althausen, Labor Gorlik Hughes, and Kosimir Lisovsky, a Pole, town dwellers. Let us note in passing the differing national origins of the group's membership, as noted for each person named. It represented rather well the diversity of the local population and even endowed the group's activities with a quite internationalist cachet. Obviously, the group's membership had been even larger, The others were either on the run or had not been charged in that there was no evidence against them. The accused whose names did not feature on the charge sheet were Budyenny, Ukrainian, who officially died of typhus in the prison infirmary but who, according to Mahkno, was strangled for his treachery by an anarchist hospitalized with him there, and another militant of the group, who had been very close to Mahkno, one Kshiva, a Jew, who was accused of having murdered the agent provocateur Kushner and was hanged on June 17, 1909. Nozor Zuachenko, Ukrainian, whose loose talk had led to the discovery of the group, contracted an acute form of typhus and could not stand trial alongside the others. This was undoubtedly a sort of ruse by the authorities who were unwilling to compromise their informant. Valdemar Antony, having fled to Belgium, emigrated shortly after that to South America where he spent many a long year working hard before turning into a Soviet patriot, returning with his family to the Soviet Union, to Kazakhstan, specifically, in the 1960s. In 1967 he even made a trip back to Guliapoli for the 50th anniversary celebrations of October 1917, but his anarchist beliefs had been lost. The other members of the group who made good their escape continued to carry out propaganda and organizing activities in the Guliapoli region, thereby clinging to the progress made by the activities of their vanished or imprisoned comrades. These activities were thus not to be in vain and were to pave the way for the burgeoning of libertarianism come 1917.